Sweat trickled down his neck as Private Thomas Cooper crouched behind the twisted wreck of what used to be a cargo hauler. The distant sounds of plasma fire lit up the night sky in brilliant flashes of blue and green, casting eerie shadows across the abandoned spaceport. His breath came in short bursts, fogging up the inside of his combat helmet as he tried to steady his racing heart. Contact, 12 o'clock. The warning crackled through his comms just as a slender figure darted between the shipping containers ahead. These weren't the usual Drachnid warriors they'd been fighting for the past 3 months. This one moved differently, with an almost feline grace that sent chills down his spine. 6 weeks ago, Earth's outer colonies had come under attack from what they initially thought was just another aggressive alien species. But as the fighting intensified, disturbing reports began filtering in about a new type of combatant. Female warriors with impossible strength and speed, who could shrug off wounds that would kill any normal soldier. The brass called them Valkyries, though Thomas thought that name was far too romantic for something so lethal. His squad had been tasked with securing this critical supply depot on Nueva Madrid, one of humanity's most important agricultural worlds. But what started as a routine operation had quickly turned into a nightmare. Of his original 12-person squad, only 4 remained. The others, he pushed the memories away, focusing on staying alive. Movement caught his eye, a flash of iridescent scales in the starlight. Before he could react, something slammed into him with the force of a charging bull. His rifle went flying as he hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Through watering eyes, he found himself staring up at his attacker. She was beautiful in the way a sword is beautiful, all deadly grace and predatory efficiency. Silvery scales covered parts of her exposed skin, shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in time with her breathing. But it was her eyes that held him frozen, vertical pupils and iris the color of molten gold, studying him with an unsettling intelligence. The alien warrior reached down, and Thomas braced himself for the end. Instead, her clawed fingers found the catches of his combat armor with surprising precision. With strength that shouldn't have been possible, she began systematically stripping away his protective gear, piece by piece. What are you doing?" He managed to gasp out, his training warring with his confusion. To his shock, she tilted her head and smiled, an expression that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. "Making sure you survive what comes next, human," she replied in perfect English, her voice carrying strange harmonics that made his bones vibrate. "Your equipment is killing you." That's when Thomas noticed the radiation warning flashing in his HUD. Somehow, his armor's protective systems had malfunctioned, slowly cooking him alive. But how had she known? And why would an enemy combatant care? The sound of approaching gunfire snapped him back to reality. His squad would be looking for him, and they wouldn't hesitate to open fire if they saw him with the enemy. But as he looked back at the alien warrior, he realized this encounter had just changed everything he thought he knew about this war. She extended a scaled hand toward him, those golden eyes seeming to peer straight into his soul. "Your people have been lied to, Thomas Cooper, about everything. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth?" Behind them, voices shouted his name. He had seconds to make a decision that would change not just his fate, but possibly the course of the entire war. The alien warrior waited patiently, her hand still extended, while the sounds of battle grew ever closer. Time seemed to freeze as Thomas stared at her outstretched hand. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was insane. She was the enemy, one of the creatures who had killed his squad mates. But something in those alien eyes held a truth he couldn't ignore. Just as his fingers brushed against her scaled palm, plasma fire erupted around them. "Cooper, get down." Sergeant Chen's voice cut through the chaos. The alien warrior moved with liquid grace, pulling Thomas behind a fallen support beam as return fire lit up the night. To his amazement, she positioned herself to shield him, her scales deflecting energy bolts that would have torn through human armor. "Your friends are persistent," she said, a hint of amusement in her multi-tone voice. "But we don't have time for this. The radiation leak is spreading, and your entire squad is at risk." She tapped something on a device wrapped around her wrist, and suddenly the air shimmered with holographic data. Thomas's eyes widened as he saw the readouts. Massive radiation signatures pulsing from what looked like damaged reactor cores buried throughout the spaceport. This wasn't a random attack, she explained quickly. Your commanders knowingly sent you into a trap. They needed proof that their new weapons worked, even if it meant sacrificing their own soldiers. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. He'd seen the unusual equipment modifications, the new protective systems installed just before this mission. Had they really been guinea pigs this whole time? The sound of his squad mates getting closer snapped him back to reality. I don't even know your name, he said, realizing how surreal this moment was. The alien warrior's lips curved in what might have been a smile. You can call me Lyra. And right now, Thomas Cooper, we need to save your friends before those reactors go critical. They moved through the shadows of the spaceport, Lyra leading them on a path that avoided the worst radiation hotspots. Thomas's mind raced with questions about her species, about this war, about everything he'd been taught to believe. But one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. The enemy wasn't who he thought it was. The drachnid warriors you've been fighting, Lyra explained as they crept past a field of twisted metal. They're as much victims as you are. Bioengineered soldiers, their minds twisted by the same people who sent you here to die. My kind, we've been trying to stop this madness before it spreads further. A scream pierced the night. Human. Thomas recognized Private Rodriguez's voice. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the sound, Lyra keeping pace effortlessly beside him. They found Rodriguez collapsed behind a cargo container, his armor's warning systems blaring. The radiation's affecting their suit systems, Lyra said, already moving to help. We need to get them out of this gear now. She looked at Thomas, those alien eyes reflecting starlight. They won't trust me. It has to be you. Thomas kept his squad calm, knowing this would be the hardest transmission of his life. Sergeant Chen, Rodriguez is down. Everyone, listen carefully. We've been set up. Our new armor systems aren't protecting us, they're killing us. We need to strip down to base layers immediately. There was a moment of stunned silence before Chen's voice came back, tight with controlled fury. Cooper, what the hell are you talking about? And where are you? As if in answer, another alarm began to sound, this one from the spaceport's ancient warning system. Lyra's expression grew grave. We're out of time. The reactors are going into cascade failure. Thomas, you need to make them understand. Now, your radiation badges. Thomas said urgently into the comm, check your radiation badges. There was a moment of rustling, then a sharp intake of breath from Chen. The small devices, standard issue but separate from their main armor systems, were all showing critical exposure levels. Rodriguez groaned as Thomas helped Lyra remove the compromised armor plates. The young private's eyes went wide at the sight of the alien warrior, but the pain and disorientation from radiation exposure kept him from reaching for his weapon. What's happening? He managed to gasp. Before Thomas could answer, the ground shook with a deep subsonic rumble. Lyra's bioluminescent patterns pulsed with increased intensity. A warning sign, he was beginning to realize. 3 minutes until the first reactor goes critical, she said, her harmonics carrying an edge of urgency he hadn't heard before. Through the darkness, Thomas saw the rest of his squad approaching, Chen and Miller, their weapons raised but not firing. They moved with the uncertainty of soldiers whose world had just been turned upside down. The radiation warnings were impossible to ignore, and their own armor systems were beginning to malfunction visibly, sparks dancing across the surface. Talk fast, Cooper, Chen ordered, though Thomas noticed she was already working to remove her helmet. The surgeon had always been pragmatic. If the evidence said their gear was killing them, she wouldn't let pride stand in the way of survival. The attack on the colonies, the whole war, it's been orchestrated, Thomas explained quickly, helping Miller out of his malfunctioning chest piece. Someone high up in command is using us to test weapons, using the drachnids as an excuse, and now they're trying to cover their tracks. Another tremor shook the spaceport, stronger this time. Overhead, the night sky had taken on an ominous purple glow. Lyra's wrist device projected a new set of readings that made Thomas's blood run cold. The radiation isn't just from the reactors, she said. They're going to trigger a chain reaction in the planet's atmosphere. Nueva Madrid isn't just a farming world. It's going to become ground zero for something much worse. Chen had her helmet off now, sweat gleaming on her face in the strange light. If what you're saying is true, she began, but was cut off by the sound of dropships approaching. Lots of them. The engines had a distinctive whine that every human soldier recognized. Special operations. They're here to clean up loose ends, Lyra said grimly. Your command never expected anyone to survive this mission. The radiation, the reactors, the atmospheric trigger, it's all to test their new Terraform-class weapons. And we're all witnesses they can't afford to leave alive. The dropships were getting closer, their searchlights cutting through the purple haze that was beginning to descend over the spaceport. Thomas looked at his squad, good soldiers, friends, people who trusted him. Then he looked at Lyra, the supposed enemy who had risked everything to save them. Miller was the first to speak up. What's the play, Sarge? Because I'm not keen on being a lab rat for whatever sick experiment this is. He had stripped down to his base layer, and Thomas could see the others had done the same. Their discarded armor lay scattered around them, internal systems still sparking and smoking. Lyra's golden eyes met Thomas's, and he saw something there, not just urgency, but hope. There's a way to stop this, she said, but we'll have to get to the central control hub. Through them. She nodded toward the approaching dropships, now visible through the haze as dark shapes bristling with weapons. Chen checked her sidearm, the only weapon they could trust now, and gave a sharp nod. Well, Cooper, your alien friend better have one hell of a plan, because we've got about 30 seconds before those ships reach us, and I'm betting they're not here to give us medals. Actually, Lyra said, her scales flickering with a pattern Thomas now recognized as anticipation. Those ships might be exactly what we need. Before anyone could question her, she pressed something on her wrist device. The air around them shimmered, and suddenly the dark shapes of dropships began to waver and distort. Holy shit, Miller whispered as the first ship's true form became visible. These weren't special operations vessels at all. They were dragnet transport pods, their camouflage systems failing under whatever signal Lyra had broadcast. But what made everyone's breath catch was the sight of their pilots, more female warriors like Lyra, their scales gleaming with different patterns and colors. The resistance, Lyra explained quickly as the pods touched down around them. We've been infiltrating their operations for months, replacing their cleanup crews whenever we could, but we never had proof of what they were really doing until now. She gestured at the failing reactors, the contaminated armor, the spreading atmospheric corruption. Thomas felt his world shift again as the pods opened and more warriors emerged. But a new sound made his blood freeze, the unmistakable thunder of actual human dropships approaching from the opposite direction. Those, Lyra said grimly, are the real special operations teams. Ken's tactical mind was already working, so we're caught between your people and ours, with experimental weapons about to turn this whole planet into a testing ground. Perfect. Despite her sarcasm, Thomas could see her eyes darting around, evaluating options, looking for angles. That's when Rodriguez, still weak but standing, noticed something strange. The radiation. It's changing. He pointed at his badge, where the readings were indeed shifting, not decreasing, but transforming into something else entirely. The purple haze around them had taken on an almost crystalline quality. One of the newly arrived warriors, her scales a deep crimson, approached Lyra and spoke in their harmonic language. Lyra's expression turned to one of horror. It's worse than we thought, she said, turning to the humans. The weapons test, the radiation, it's not just about terraforming. They're trying to force accelerated evolution, create some kind of hybrid army, and we're all part of the experiment. As if to confirm her words, Thomas noticed his skin beginning to tingle where the purple haze touched it. Rodriguez gasped, holding up his hands where faint, iridescent patterns were beginning to form beneath the skin, the same patterns that marked the scales of their supposed enemies. That's impossible, Chen breathed, but they could all see it happening. The division between human and alien was literally dissolving before their eyes. In the distance, the first human dropships were landing, disgorging squads of heavily armed troops. But Thomas noticed something odd about their movements. They were avoiding the areas of heaviest radiation rather than pushing through with their supposedly protective gear. They know, he realized. The commanders in those ships know exactly what this stuff does. They're here to collect data, not survivors. The implications hit him like a physical blow. How long had this been planned? How many other battles had been staged for this purpose? Lyra's crimson-scaled companion made an urgent sound, pointing to the reactor readings. "We have perhaps 5 minutes." Lyra translated. "After that, the reaction becomes irreversible, not just for us, but for every living thing on this planet." She looked at Thomas, then at Chen. "We can still stop this, but you need to make a choice. Right now." The air crackled with energy as the human forces began establishing a perimeter. Behind them, the Drachnid resistance warriors waited silently, their own weapons powered but not yet raised. And in between stood Thomas, his squad, and Lyra, caught in a transformation they didn't understand, faced with a choice that would reshape not just their lives, but potentially the future of both species. Chen checked her radiation badge one last time, watched the strange patterns spreading across her skin, and made a decision. "Well," she said, chambering around in her sidearm, "I always wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. Just didn't expect it to be quite so literal." The squad moved as one unit through the crystalline haze, Lyra and her warriors flanking them. Thomas could feel the changes accelerating in his body, enhanced strength flowing through his muscles, sharper vision cutting through the purple murk. What should have been terrifying somehow felt right. "The control hub's main entrance will be heavily guarded," Chen said, her tactical mind adapting to their new reality. "But if this transformation is affecting us, what's it doing to them?" She nodded toward the Special Ops forces, who were maintaining an unusually wide perimeter around the radiation zones. Lyra's scales pulsed with what Thomas now understood was a battle pattern. "They're scared," she said, satisfaction evident in her harmonics. "Their protective suits can't stop the change completely. Every minute they spend here, their own weapons work against them." Rodriguez, who had been studying his increasingly luminescent skin, suddenly grabbed Thomas's arm. "Look!" Through the haze, they could see the Special Ops soldiers arguing, some removing their helmets, others backing away from the perimeter. The chain of command was breaking down as the reality of their situation became clear. "They were never told the whole truth," Lyra explained. "Just like you, they were meant to be sacrificed. But their leaders made one crucial mistake." She shared a knowing look with her crimson-scaled companion. "They assumed the transformation would make us easier to control. Instead." As if on cue, Thomas felt a new awareness bloom in his mind. A connection. He could sense his squad mates, the Drachnid warriors, even the panicking Special Ops soldiers. They were becoming a network, their thoughts and intentions flowing together like streams joining a river. "The control hub," Thomas said suddenly, the plan forming in his connected mind. "We don't need to fight our way in. We are already in." He looked at Lyra, saw the confirmation in her golden eyes. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was giving them access to the very systems meant to control them. Chen caught on quickly. "Miller, Rodriguez, link with the resistance warriors. Spread out and keep the Special Ops busy. Cooper, you and Lyra head for the hub. Whatever you're going to do, do it fast. Those reactors won't wait." The next few minutes were a blur of motion and light. Thomas and Lyra raced through the facility, their enhanced bodies moving with impossible speed. The few guards they encountered hesitated, their own transformations making them question their orders just long enough. They reached the hub's sealed doors with 2 minutes to spare. Thomas placed his transforming hand on the biosensor, feeling the system recognize him as both authorized personnel and something new. The doors slid open with a hiss. Inside, banks of holographic controls filled the air. Lyra moved to the central console, her patterns synchronizing with the display. "The override sequence," she said. "Quick." Thomas joined her, their merged abilities making the complex alien technology feel natural. But as they worked, a slow clapping echoed through the hub. From the shadows emerged a figure, a high-ranking officer, but one whose transformation was far more advanced than anyone else's. His entire body rippled with iridescent scales, his eyes pools of liquid gold. "Did you really think we didn't plan for this?" His voice carried the same harmonics as Lyra's. "The transformation, the resistance, even your little rebellion. All of it was part of the design. We needed catalysts, you see. Strong minds who would embrace the change, lead others through it. And you've performed beautifully." Thomas felt his connection to the others pulse with alarm. This wasn't just about weapons or armies. They had been part of something far more vast, the deliberate evolution of both species. But as he looked at Lyra, he saw not defeat in her eyes, but triumph. "No, General," she said, her patterns blazing. "You didn't plan for everything." She grabbed Thomas's hand, their combined connection to the system surging. "You forgot the most important thing about evolution. The hub's controls responded to their merged consciousness, not with the predetermined programming, but with something entirely new. It can't be controlled." The reactors began to pulse, but not with destruction. Instead, they became beacons, broadcasting the transformation across not just the planet, but into space itself. The change would no longer be a weapon or a tool of control. It was becoming a gift, freely given to both species. The general's confident smile faltered as he realized the truth. In trying to force evolution to serve their purposes, they had created something far more powerful, genuine unity. And as Thomas stood there, hand in hand with Lyra, he understood that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. 3 months after the events at Nueva Madrid, Thomas stood at the observation deck of the joint human-Drachnid peace station, watching ships from both species dock and depart in perfect harmony. His scaled hand rested against the transparent aluminum viewport, patterns of bioluminescence shifting with his thoughtful mood. The transformation had spread exactly as they'd intended that day, not as a weapon or a means of control, but as a bridge between two species that had been manipulated into conflict. The general and his conspirators were now facing justice before a combined tribunal, their plans for weaponized evolution exposed to both governments. Still admiring the view, Lyra's familiar harmonics brought a smile to his face. She joined him at the viewport, her own patterns synchronizing with his naturally. Behind them, Chen, now sporting impressive silver scales that complemented her commanding presence, led a mixed group of human and Drachnid recruits through the station's corridors. "Just thinking about how differently things could have turned out," Thomas replied. "If you hadn't stripped off my armor that day." Lyra's patterns flickered with amusement at the memory. What had seemed like a terrifying encounter then now felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. The peace station had become a symbol of their shared future. Rodriguez worked in the medical bay, his unique insights into the transformation process helping others adapt to their new abilities. Miller had found his calling as a cultural liaison, his natural charm transcending species barriers. Even the most hardened veterans from both sides had discovered that their differences meant little compared to their shared humanity, or perhaps their shared evolution. "The latest reports from Earth are encouraging," Lyra said, pulling up a holographic display with a gesture. "The transformation has stabilized in both populations. No more forced changes, no weapons program. Just natural adaptation at each individual's own pace. Some choose to remain fully human, others embrace complete transformation, but most find their own balance in between." Thomas nodded, watching a group of children, human, Drachnid, and transformed, playing together in the station's recreation area. They had no concept of the artificial barriers that had once divided their peoples. To them, this was simply how things were meant to be. "You know what's funny?" he mused. "They wanted to create the perfect soldiers, but instead they gave us the tools to make war obsolete. The connection we share, the ability to truly understand each other's thoughts and feelings, it makes conflict almost impossible." Lyra's scales shimmered with agreement. Evolution always finds a way, not the path we try to force it down, but the one we need most. She took his hand, their patterns merging into a beautiful display of shared emotion. "Though I have to admit, I never expected that ripping your clothes off would lead to all this." Thomas laughed. the sound carrying both human warmth and drachnid harmonics. I'm just glad you did, even if Chen still teases me about it during every staff meeting. Through their shared connection, they could feel the peace station's rhythm, thousands of minds working together, learning, growing, building a future neither species could have imagined on their own. The war that had been meant to divide them had instead brought them together in ways their manipulators never could have predicted. As they stood there watching the stars, Thomas realized that their story would be told for generations, not as a tale of conflict and violence, but as a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes come from moments of trust between supposed enemies. And it all started with an alien warrior who cared enough to save a human soldier from his own armor. So, Lyra said with a mischievous harmonic, "Ready for our next adventure." Thomas smiled, his patterns brightening. In this new universe of infinite possibilities, that was the only answer anyone needed. Always.